Today we're going to talk about happiness, and I think most of us think of happiness as the pursuit of pleasure. That's sort of how it's evolved recently. But classical thinkers, Plato, Socrates, people who wrote in ancient languages, and Enlightenment thinkers, the philosophers and theologians of the Enlightenment who really influenced the founders of our country, really defined happiness as the pursuit of virtue. In other words, happiness was about being good, not feeling good. Thomas Jefferson and others at the start of our country were very concerned that the chaotic nature of the human life would be an obstacle for most people if they didn't have some kind of internal moral compass. In other words, you can't legislate morality, right? People need an internal compass as well as some external laws and limits. And our founders asked, because of the kinds of things they read, and they were big on reason. Remember, the Age of Enlightenment, also called the Age of Reason? But they questioned whether reason, unaided reason, just your reason, so this is for all of you who say, I'm just practical, that's my bottom line, I'm just practical, was not enough to help people subdue their lesser passions, which hits pretty close to home for some of our founders, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. The idea that people would behave virtuously just because the Bible promises rewards or punishment just really didn't fly with our founders, because most of them, and in fact, to this day, fewer than 5% of Americans would call themselves true biblical literalists. If you give them a definition of biblical literalism, which means you take the Bible literally, fewer than 5% of people are willing to say, okay, the world is flat, God made it in 7 days. Not that many. So for this reason, they felt that it was important that everyone develop a strong self-discipline for their emotions and for their moral behavior. What a fun bunch. And they weren't the Pilgrims or the Puritans. They were the enlightened guys. They were the liberals of their day. So anyway, I'm glad you're here to talk with me about this. I think you'll be happy you came. See what I did there? This all started because I read something about, from this book called The Pursuit of Happiness, about Benjamin Franklin, who was in his 20s, so we'll give him some slack here, he was in his 20s, decided that it was so important for a happy life to have some measure of a moral compass, some self-discipline, that he created 12 character traits that needed to be worked on every day. And his plan was that he would make a little chart and he would put a black mark next to each one of these that he had failed to do in a day. So we're going to have a little quiz here. Temperance, eat not to dullness, drink not to elevation. How are you? It's early today, yeah. How about tomorrow? How about yesterday? Silence, speak not but what may benefit others or yourself. Avoid trifling conversation. Order, let all your things have their places. Look, I just moved 6 weeks ago. It's a mess. Let each part of your business have its time. Industry, lose no time. This is the opposite of relax. Justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility. Don't be disturbed at trifles. Now, mind you, these people did not have to drive the LA freeways. Be not disturbed at trifles, accidents, common or unavoidable. Chastity. And, well, Franklin shared this with some of his friends, and one of them said, who was a Quaker, said to him, you left one off. It's really important for you to add this. It's really important for you to add this. Humility. And you won't be surprised to find that he was only in his 20s. He couldn't quite cope with how many black marks there were on his notebook of these things, and he just gave it up. He just eventually abandoned the project. But he writes, on the whole, though I never arrived at perfection, I'd been so ambitious of obtaining, but fell far short of, yet I was, by the endeavor by the endeavor, a better and happier man than otherwise should have been if I had not attempted it. Is that so different than our goals? As United Methodist Christians, and probably some others too, but this is where we are, that we want to be better people who are making a better world. It's not real complicated. We want to be better people, making a better world. We have something deeply in common with our founders and the classical writers when we acknowledge that to be the center of our life. And it's difficult because that is not, in the last, less than 100 years, the goals that are widely shared. So, according to Franklin and the dozens of classical writers who greatly influenced our founders because of the way elites were educated in those days, they read a lot of the classics, a lot of Enlightenment philosophers. What the pursuit of happiness really is emotional and spiritual self-discipline in pursuit of virtue. Now, when you think to yourself, gosh, what can I do to make myself happy? I'm guessing that's not what pops first in your mind, right? A trip to Disneyland, pop open a beer, quit your job. I don't know, there's just a lot of things that would come ahead for me when I'm thinking about emotional and spiritual self-discipline. But when I am calm and kind of in the spiritual flow, I recognize that the pursuit of virtue is, in fact, how I learn to be happy. One of the most widely read books was by a Stoic named Cicero. And we know the founders read Cicero, a lot of them. It was very common. There's sort of a top 12 that most of them read, is because most of the founders of our country and other prominent people who were working on the founding and the early years of our country had these, what they called, and we would still call, an elite education, but it was grounded in classical writers. And we know this because Franklin, Jefferson, and all of them, they kept lists of what they read. And Cicero's Tuscan Disputations, and I've never read that, I can barely pronounce it. Cicero's Tuscan Disputations, O philosophy, guide of life. Philosophy, by which we might understand religion, because religion fell under the category of philosophy. Searcher out of virtue and exterminator of vice. Searcher out of virtue, exterminator of vice. So in the pursuit of happiness, our founders read a lot of classical authors. And that was a standard part of an educated gentleman's life. And very often, a standard part of a gentlewoman's life, too. If you had an education beyond reading, writing, and the kind of arithmetic and math you needed for day-to-day commerce, and to read the newspaper, if you had what we would call a higher education, you had what we would call a liberal education. You read classicists, you read the Enlightenment philosophers, you read Eastern and Western wisdom writers, and you knew your Bible. You read your Bible. At the tender age of 13, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who went to Brooklyn Elementary Public School 238, wrote an essay about the 4 documents that moved her, 13-year-old. And these were the documents that she studied in her school: the 10 Commandments, the Magna Carta, the English Bill of Rights, 1689, and the Declaration of Independence. Not as indoctrination, but as information. All 4 of those, 13-year-old Ruth Bader Ginsburg. In other words, she had a classical education. Ben Franklin did all that reading and concluded that reason, our powers of reasoning, were the most important powers we had, because that was how we could hold our immediate emotions in check and pull back on the desires that were going to lead us away from spiritual harmony and the well-being for everyone. All true happiness, all that is truly beautiful, can only result from order, says Ben Franklin. It's not what a modern person would say, largely because many of us have never really matured beyond adolescence. How we feel is our reality. How we feel is our reality. Study up on flat earthers. I read an interview with a flat earther once who said, yes, I know the science. Yes, I look at the science. Yes, I believe the science, but I just feel in my heart that it's a flat earth, so I believe it's a flat earth. This comes a little closer to home if you mistake someone's interest and attention and you decide that they're in love with you, but they're not. There are so many ways that our feelings lead us astray because modern life does not really encourage growing and learning. We are obsessed with youth. We are obsessed with youth. And according to classical writers, youthfulness is not happiness. No young people can truly be happy if you believe the classical writers and the Enlightenment writers. You have to live a little. Now, the older you get, the more satisfied you can feel about that. But if you remember when you were 22 or 27 or 35 or 39, you weren't an idiot either. We all grow and develop according to what life sends us, or we don't. And classical authorities viewed this as kind of, are any of you aware of the marshmallow experiment at Stanford in 1972? Raise your hand if you've heard of that. Okay, 2 teachers. Here's what they did. They took a bunch of kids. Now, this is a long-term study. They took a bunch of kids, and they offered the kids 1 marshmallow now or 2 marshmallows if they would wait 15 minutes. I have a 5-and-a-half-year-old who would want to know why he couldn't have all 3 of them right now. What they discovered as they followed this experiment through the years was that the kids who could, I don't know what age these kids were, 5, 6, 7, 8, 2, I don't know. The kids who could wait 15 minutes for 2 marshmallows had much better life outcomes by every measure. They were healthier, they were more stable, they had higher incomes, they had more stable relationships, they were less inclined to be involved in crime. How about you? Are you a 1 marshmallow person or a 2 marshmallow person? Madison and Hamilton wrote that we needed to focus on the promotion of the public good. And we've really left that one behind, haven't we? Rather than personal happiness, because personal happiness forgoes short-term gratification and requires self-regulation. And this is what the founders were steeped in. This is what classical writers and philosophers and religious writers were steeped in, and this is the education and the deep conviction of our founders. It comes from Cicero, Plato, Socrates, Locke, Hume. And the reason most of us don't know the names of these people is because sometime after World War II, we decided that the only thing people really needed education for was to earn a living. And so we abandoned that kind of education unless you had a liberal arts university education. It is rather recent that the pursuit of feeling good has trumped being good. Anything that gets between me and what I want is interfering with my pursuit of happiness. You hear it from people all the time, don't you? But I want to get where I want to go, so you should get out of my way. Right? And it's very difficult to explain to people that your freedoms stop right where they start to impinge on mine, right? But if you've thought about the general well-being, if you've thought about virtue, then that begins to come naturally. Now, our founders had some struggles with this. They had some struggles, and if you're an American history buff, you probably know what some of these were. They were really pretty in awe of their own self-awareness and human intelligence. Although Jefferson was known to say this is only true for white men, black people and women don't have this. So, mark against Jefferson. But they marveled not only at their capacity to imagine a life of virtue, but by striving and knowing and understanding, they were also kind of astonished at how hard it was and how deeply they failed. In Benjamin Franklin's case, chastity was really kind of his stumbling block. Now, that was true for the time. So even by the standards of the time, which required chastity from a wife and not from a husband, Ben Franklin was known to be profligate. He really liked Paris. And that frustrated him. And he expected that his wife would not have that trouble, but his lusts were a problem that interfered in his life in some very specific ways, but also he struggled with self-esteem over his inability to get over that. Thomas Jefferson, who I'm rather fond of Thomas Jefferson, His problem was avarice. He had 600 enslaved people, and he wrote more than one treatise on the disgusting, sinful, evil institution of slavery. But he, at the same time, admitted that he liked his lifestyle too much to free his slaves, because if he freed his slaves, he would not be able to have the affluent lifestyle. Now, I'll tell you what impresses me. He put that in writing. He put it in writing, what was considered even in his own day something of a failing. And we would consider it even worse than they did then. But he was willing to be aspirational about his life, to say, what would be better is if I could let go of my comforts and the things I have as a wealthy person for the freedom of these people who, though they're less than me, may deserve better than what they have. But I just can't do it. So this is what our founders thought our country should be based on. Doing what's moral, what's virtuous, not just what you feel like doing or what's good for you. And they did not spare themselves in this judgment. They wrote of their own personal struggles around this. And Thomas Jefferson is a really interesting case. More examples from Thomas Jefferson. That's just me. He put in writing that he thought the moral system, so there's a caveat there, the moral system of Jesus is the most perfect and sublime that was ever taught to humanity. However, in a startling failure of humility, Jefferson took a razor and some glue and cut apart his New Testament for the parts he thought were valid and important and just jettisoned the rest. Which I have to say, it was the beginning of the modern text quoting tendency where Christians, even in our day, will quote you the quote out of context that defends their argument, but they don't really know the whole Bible. At the very least, Jefferson had to read everything to do that. The second president of the United States, John Adams, stated in writing, "The government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion." This is in the Treaty of Tripoli. Not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. I don't think that's accurate. I don't think that's accurate. It may be that there is no intention to found our country on a particular religious platform. But Christianity was in the water. And there were people from long before 1776 who had different religions. They came from other places. Most of the slaves, the American slaves, had a whole bunch of religions. And it wasn't till hundreds of years after slavery started that they were taught Christianity. A kind of secular deism was popular. People were churchgoers, but they weren't maybe as convinced of some things. But it's not possible for Christianity not to have influenced our founders. So I'm going to disagree with John Adams. I understand what he's trying to say. He's trying to say no favorite religion. We don't use a religion as our guideline. We have freedom of religion. But to say that Christianity had no part in shaping our country is just not right. Every culture promotes what a vision of happiness looks like. And in postmodern America, we would say health, prosperity, and popularity. Health, prosperity, and popularity. But I think the place to look for Jesus' version of the pursuit of happiness is in the Sermon on the Mount. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus proposes a definition of happiness wildly different than anything we are accustomed to hearing, but much more like that of our founders. The Sermon on the Mount gathers not a sermon, but it's a collection of Jesus' sayings, things he must have taught over and over and over and over and over, the heart of his teachings. And they're collected together in this cohesive, memorable, powerful, and essential teaching. And it really is a list, if you read it, of how to act, not what to think. How to act, not what to think. Our happiness, or as our founders might say, our effectiveness or our usefulness, doesn't depend on our success in popularity or worth. It has to do with our capacity to discipline ourselves toward virtue. And it is a wildly ambitious proposition. And it is an even more wildly ridiculous proposition to suggest that an entire country could be based on the idea that we held that shared value. That my happiness is related to your happiness, and our happiness is about virtue, not feeling. Jesus must have preached a lot of sermons and taught his disciples a lot of stuff we don't hear in the Sermon on the Mount. But if you read those 3 chapters, you will find that for Jesus, the love of God is absolutely, inextricably tied to ethics. And in fact, I would suggest that you learn to love God when you practice love. You learn to love God when you practice love. In other words, act first, feel later. Act your way into right feeling. Do the things you think are right. Do the things other people's teachings whom you respect suggest are right, and you will find your heart changes. Don't wait for your heart to change. That didn't work out for Thomas Jefferson's slaves at all. What is interesting is not that the founders fell short of their moral aspirations, their moral perfection. John Wesley liked to say, we are moving on to perfection, and I'm always like, really, really slowly. But what surprises you, if you want to read a book like this or you want to read this part of history, is the seriousness with which they took the quest to build the happiness of virtue, to become more perfect. And I believe that most of them had to have met the God of their understanding in that quest. And that, my friends, is what we call grace.